As I have made videos for this channel, I have tried to make an intentional effort to showcase my love for video game soundtracks. They are something that I'm extremely passionate about, and if a game has an amazing soundtrack, it is no doubt one of the best aspects of the game for me. Even in video production like the video you're watching right now, music is a major factor in the enjoyment that you can get from this video. After all, if there is no music, then you'd be stuck sitting here in the quiet with me. And for early video games or systems that lacked major processing power, the backbone of their soundtracks was using something called sound chips. Now, I will fully admit that I'm neither a musician or a video game developer, just a dope who does some internet research, so I will be focusing less on exactly how the music was developed in these platforms, with the software they had at the time, and more on the soundtracks themselves and why they have so much charm in my mind. But to discuss this topic, we have to go back to the beginning, to the late 1900s. 1980s and 90s, I'm talking about those decades. So when you listen to music, you likely notice that there are many parts that go into making a good song, especially with big bands. In a rock band, for example, you will often have a guitar part, a bass part, a drum part, and a vocal part, and each of these come together to make a coherent sound. When talking about video game music, this same logic applies. The music is broken into parts commonly called channels. Each of these channels plays a different part of the song. And in the case of sound chips for consoles and old computers, the channels were electronic tones that were made to imitate real-life instruments. Because these are simply just electronic tones that merely imitate real-life instruments, it creates a very unique style of sound. And some of the soundtracks that use sound chips had mixed reception. Music started off pretty basic on devices like the Nintendo Entertainment System, where there were only 4 channels to make music for some of the most popular early games to exist. But as time went on, the technology evolved further and further, and more channels were added, or existing channels could support more sound types now to support more dynamic music. This evolution can be seen when looking at music from different eras. Let's boot up Super Mario Bros. On the NES real quick. Oh nice! I like this music. Very catchy if not a little simplistic. Very cool, Nintendo. You should make more games of this Mario guy. He seems cool. Meanwhile, let's boot up Doom on my Epic Gaming PC. Oh yeah! Yeah! It becomes clear looking at these soundtracks side by side how these sound chips were able to evolve and make a more unique style of sound for each game that was released. And with that, I'd like to delve into one of the most recent games that cemented my obsession with sound chip soundtracks. The biggest benefit that Final Fantasy VII had when changing from being on Nintendo home consoles to the PlayStation 1 was the fact that the PlayStation had significantly more power. And let me tell you that the developers of this game squeezed every last drop of power this console had into this game. This is similar to how Tifa squeezed every last drop out of the Italian Senate. I was able to play this game for the first time just a few months ago, and I had one of the most enjoyable journeys in a JRPG that I have ever had, and I finally understood why everyone adores this game. But the one thing I love about this game the most is the soundtrack that this game bolsters with such limited technology in comparison to modern standards. It is always a hot topic when discussing limitations fostering innovation, because objectively by giving artists more tools to create and making the process easier, it is able to create more diverse art. But what Nobuo Uematsu was able to create with the soundtrack of this game is truly incredible. Each song in this soundtrack has such a distinct feel from one another. Like here, take a listen to the theme of Cait Sith and Battle On. The music created from the sound chip creates such a unique fingerprint of being whimsical yet epic at the same time that makes the game so much more memorable in my mind. Now, many people argue that sound chips as a tech limitation sort of put a handicap limitation on the development of a soundtrack because of what could have been a fully orchestrated soundtrack was reduced to electronic signals that merely imitate the instruments they sound like. And I find this point to be quite interesting, and thankfully Final Fantasy VII has been lucky enough to have multiple games remaking it for modern systems in the form of Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Each of these games remakes a third of the overall game, with the final game releasing in the next few years. My opinion on these games and how they handled the task of adapting the original soundtrack to modern systems is a bit mixed. Some of the tracks in this game I found to lack the charm that the original song had. Take this example of Dawn of the Slums from the PS1 version compared to the PS4 remake version. But on the other hand, when you're dealing with songs with way more complex elements like the musical explosion that is One Winged Angel, I find that the full orchestration complements the track amazingly. While the results of changing pretty much the entire soundtrack to full orchestration has some pretty mixed results for me personally, I still find myself returning to the PS1 Final Fantasy VII soundtrack more often because its limited sound capabilities make for a more unique sound that fits the tone of the game more overall compared to its remakes. But after discussing the soundtracks of the 1980s and 90s, let's delve into games that use more modern sound chips. As consoles moved further away from dedicated sound chips in the 2000s in favor of having pre-recorded MP3s played, there is one line of consoles that kept the sound chip dream alive, that being the Nintendo DS and the iterations that followed it. Being a handheld console, there was much less processing power as the form factor had to be smaller, and so sound chips lived on. And let me tell you, the sound chip in the DS was not messing around, as there is no better example than by using one of my favorite games of all time as the next example. Pokemon Black is definitely not the first Pokemon game on the DS, but it is the game that has made the biggest impact on me as a child, being one of the first games I ever played. And yes, I've had a very blessed childhood by being able to experience Pokemon Black and White as a young child. And I was also cool as fuck for playing Pokemon as a kid. I ruled the elementary school playground with my Pokemon cheats. The gameplay, the story, the Pokemon, all of it is just absolute cinema, but the music in the game is just simply built different. Prepare for some absolute Pokemon soundtrack glazing, as these are just some of the songs utilized in the Pokemon Black and White soundtrack. Every piece of music in this game, like Final Fantasy, works just so well with the sound chip style that it adds so much to the overall feel of the game. Black and White's soundtrack is based heavily around the use of horns and gives the soundtrack such a distinct flair compared to other games. And you get all of this in one small cartridge in a device that you can take with you anywhere you want to go. Pokemon Black and White are truly just goated pieces of media. Also, Cynthia is my wife. Back off, losers. But Pokemon Black and White is just the tip of the iceberg when you're talking about incredible music in the Nintendo DS era. There are other Pokemon games in the system, each one with its own incredible style compared to the games before it. Another series that just absolutely killed it on the DS is a series I just recently talked about on this channel, but the Ace Attorney games soundtracks are absolute flames. The music in Ace Attorney actually feels like it is dancing out of the screen, and it just increases the rather mundane gameplay of a visual novel through the roof. Just take a listen to some of these tracks and tell me that sound chip soundtracks are worse than modern soundtracks. The Nintendo DS and 3DS produced some absolute heat in an era where audio chip soundtracks were becoming a thing of the past, as developers could store the music in MP3 files and put that in the game because there is more space to store that kind of music. In the present day, we live now in an age where pretty much every device around us is extremely powerful by being able to play sounds in higher definitions and in better ways than by the old ways of using sound chips. Modern handhelds no longer need to lower musical quality in order to have their game run on a console, which is a fantastic achievement in its own way. But even the Switch can barely run Snake without overheating. But at least the music sounds good. However, because game developers now have the tools to create close to whatever they want in whatever way that they want, that gives them more freedom on how video games can sound now. And there are a large number of developers that love the art styles of older games and the soundtracks that went along with them. Because of that, you now have video game soundtracks that are a hybrid of old sound chip sounds mixed with professional instrumental elements. One of the most famous modern games with this style of soundtrack is Undertale, where I am sure its music is in no need for introduction, as it has been played around the entire internet for forever now. It uses a sound chip sound by using sound fonts, which gave the game a very unique take on modern RPGs, along with the rest of its very revolutionary mechanics. The whole game feels like a love letter to older RPGs, but with modern features that make it an absolute joy to play. Alright, I'm moving on now. I don't need to sit here and say that Undertale is good. Water's wet. Sonic Mania has another similar soundtrack style, where a lot of the music it has mimics the sound of old sound font soundtracks, but with modern mixing methods. And by the success of the game and how much people loved the soundtrack, it is safe to say that the sound chip soundtrack styles wins a big favor with Sonic fans for faithful remakes. My last example is the most recent game that I have played with this hybrid soundtrack style of retro and modern, Sea of Stars. While I do have complaints about the game's pacing and generally repetitive story, I absolutely cannot fault the style of this game one bit, as it blends the style of old and new in some of the best ways I have ever seen in a modern game. The pixel art is some of the best and most detailed I have ever seen in a game, and the developers of this game need to be applauded for just how well this game looks. And to go along with the gorgeous presentation of the game, Sea of Stars' soundtrack has such an effective mix of sound chip musical notes mixed with full instrumentation like electric guitars. The game's composer Eric Brown stated himself that the Sea of Stars' soundtrack uses very identifiable SNES instruments to dominate the foreground of each piece of music, while not being bound to track limitations, adding more layers and using modern production techniques. And this is all part of an effort by Sabotage Studio to modernize retro aesthetics while keeping what really works from that era. This dedication to keeping faithful to a retro style should be commended, and I give major props to Sabotage and Eric Brown for their work on the game. Overall, while soundtracks of full instrumentation and the backing of a full orchestra are amazing, sound chip soundtracks will always be super charming to me, and they deserve all of the praise that they get from the players. So while using sound chips and sound fonts are no longer the primary way that video game music is played to the player, it is safe to say that the sound chip style of music is not going anywhere with such passionate people loving the style just as much as I do. Thank you everyone for watching this video and listening to me gush about video game sound chips, as it is a niche topic when talking about video games, but I hope that you learned something and have come to appreciate just how unique sound chip video game soundtracks are, like I do. Thanks everyone for watching the video. If you liked it, feel free to like the video, it helps the video out and shares it to more people, and I'm also setting the ambitious goal for myself this year of trying to hit 1,000 subscribers, because that'd be a really awesome goal. But yeah, other than that, thanks everyone, and I hope you have a great one. Peace.